The Battle of Queen Boudica, Rome's defiance against overwhelming odds. Standing at the edge of a narrow valley in 61 CE, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus watched as the British horde surged toward his vastly outnumbered legions. The din was apocalyptic. 230,000 warriors screaming war cries, beating weapons against shields, their chariots thundering across the plain. At their head rode Queen Boudica, flame-haired and terrible in her fury, commanding the largest force ever assembled against Rome on British soil. Behind Suetonius stood just 10,000 legionaries arranged with mathematical precision, silent and disciplined as they awaited their commander's signal. This wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of worlds. Roman order against Celtic chaos, imperial calculation against tribal rage. In the next few hours, either Rome would lose Britain forever, or one of history's most astonishing military victories would be written in blood. Rome's deadly gamble, the burden of command. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus had not slept properly in weeks. The governor of Britain paced the wooden floor of his command tent, the oil lamps casting long shadows as he studied the crude map of the province spread before him. His weathered face, lined from 25 years of military campaigns, betrayed nothing of the crushing weight of his decisions. Just 3 months earlier, he had led the cream of Rome's military might, the 14 of Gemina and XX Valeria legions, westward to crush the Druids on the island of Mona, leaving the southeastern settlements dangerously exposed. It was a calculated risk. The Druids represented the spiritual heart of British resistance, their sacred groves a constant source of rebellion against Roman rule. Destroying them would break the spiritual backbone of resistance once and for all. But Paulinus knew better than most that Rome's grip on Britain remained tenuous, even after 18 years of occupation. The province was a patchwork of uneasy client kingdoms, conquered tribes, and half-built Roman towns. Civilization imposed its sword point. "The natives are restless again," his intelligence officer had reported just before the Mona expedition. The officer, a Gaul who had spent years learning the British dialects, described unusual movements among the Iceni and Trinovantes tribes. "Nothing serious," he'd assured Paulinus, "just the usual grumbling about taxes and land seizures." Paulinus had nodded, deciding the risk was acceptable. The procurator, Catus Decianus, would handle any minor disturbances. After all, the southeastern tribes were officially allies of Rome. The Iceni king Prasutagus had been a loyal Roman client for years, even naming Emperor Nero as co-heir to his kingdom in his will. Such arrangements typically ensured a smooth transition to Roman rule. What Paulinus couldn't have anticipated was the breathtaking incompetence of Rome's civilian administration. While he was slaughtering Druids in the west, Decianus had ordered his men to treat the recently deceased king's kingdom as conquered territory. They flogged Queen Boudica, violated her daughters, and enslaved Iceni nobles. They called in loans that Roman financiers had forced upon the tribe, seizing land and property when payments couldn't be made. They even plundered the tribe's sacred sites, treating the natives with a contempt that transformed grumbling into murderous rage. By the time Paulinus received word of trouble, Camulodunum was already in flames. The colony of retired legionaries, men who had spent their prime subduing the very people among whom they now lived, had been overrun in a day. The 8th Legion, rushing to their aid under Quintus Petilius Cerealis, had been ambushed and nearly destroyed, its infantry cut to pieces while Cerealis escaped with just his cavalry. Now Paulinus faced an impossible choice. The province's food stores, tax revenues, and administrative centers lay in the southeast. Londinium was already growing into an important trading hub. Verulamium boasted fine Roman villas and temples. All stood directly in the path of Boudica's gathering storm. Yet to defend them would mean facing overwhelming odds in unfavorable terrain. How many warriors? Paulinus asked his scout, a Batavian auxiliary with a reputation for accuracy. "At least 200,000, possibly more," the man replied, his voice steady despite the implications. "Every tribe that ever resented Rome has joined her. They believe she has divine favor." Paulinus nodded, his decision crystallizing. He would abandon Londinium and Verulamium to their fate. The survival of Roman Britain depended not on holding territory, but on preserving his legions. If he could choose the right ground, if his men held firm against the British onslaught, there might yet be a province to reclaim when the dust settled. He summoned his commanders, hardened men who had climbed through the ranks during the brutal Germanic campaigns. "We withdraw northward," he told them, pointing to a position along Watling Street. "We'll make our stand where the road narrows between the hills. The supply wagons go ahead now." "The civilians in Londinium?" asked his second-in-command. Paulinus's expression didn't change. "Tell those who can to evacuate. The rest are on their own. The Roman machine could not afford sentiment." The empire had been built on pragmatic brutality, and he would not be the man to break that tradition, regardless of the human cost. As his officers dispersed to relay the orders, Paulinus returned to the map. He knew what awaited the abandoned settlements: slaughter, fire, and destruction. He knew also that history would judge him harshly if he failed. But in that moment, he saw the narrow path to victory that no one else could perceive. The coming battle would hinge on discipline against emotion, training against numbers, and the superior killing geometry of Roman tactics against the chaotic fury of the tribes. Suetonius Paulinus, who had never believed in the gods, permitted himself a bitter smile as he realized he was about to stake the future of Roman Britain on the oldest gamble in warfare. That quality would triumph over quantity, that the few could defeat the many if they held the right ground and kept their nerve in the face of terror. Boudica's vengeance, the Queen's fury unleashed. Boudica stood alone at dawn, watching the sacred oak groves burn. Roman torches had set the ancient trees ablaze, their sap popping and hissing in the flames. The druids who had tended these groves for generations lay slaughtered among the roots. She inhaled deeply, drawing the acrid smoke into her lungs, letting hatred crystallize in her chest. 6 months earlier, she had been merely the wife of a Roman client king, navigating the careful diplomacy required of conquered peoples. Now she was something else entirely, a living vessel of vengeance, chosen by the gods to expel the Roman cancer from British soil. The transformation had come swiftly after her husband Prasutagus died. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, had arrived with clerks and soldiers, not to honor the king's will, but to inventory his possessions. When Boudica protested, citing her husband's arrangement with Emperor Nero, the Romans had laughed. "You are not a queen anymore," the procurator had told her. "You are nothing." What followed would become the catalyst for the greatest British uprising in history. The Romans stripped her naked and flogged her before her people. They violated her daughters, girls not yet 14. They enslaved Iceni nobles, seized tribal lands, and plundered the royal household. In a single day, they transformed a peaceful client kingdom into a cauldron of hate. What the Romans failed to understand was who they were dealing with. Boudica was not merely royal by marriage. She was Iceni aristocracy in her own right, trained from childhood in both warfare and tribal politics. Her name itself, Boudica, the victorious, had been earned in her youth. The tribal elders had seen something in the tall, fierce woman with copper hair and a voice that carried across battlefields. The Romans saw only a barbarian queen. They missed the brilliant mind calculating behind her piercing gaze. As she watched the sacred grove burn, Boudica made her decision. The time for diplomacy had ended. The gods themselves demanded blood for blood. Mother, her eldest daughter, called from behind her. The girl's face still bore the bruises from Roman hands. The tribal leaders have arrived. Boudica turned. Where once she had worn the gold torques and fine woven garments of a client queen, she now dressed for war. A checked cloak fastened at her shoulder. Her hair hung loose and wild down her back, a statement in itself, as Iceni warriors let their hair flow free only in times of war. Around her neck hung a single massive torque of twisted gold, a symbol of her authority. At her side, a long Celtic sword with an ornate hilt. Inside the great roundhouse, representatives from a dozen tribes waited: Trinovantes, Catuvelaoni, Dobunni, Cornovi, and others who had suffered under Roman rule. Many were ancient enemies of the Iceni, but Roman cruelty had forged a new unity among the British peoples. "Brothers," Boudica addressed them, eschewing formalities, "the Romans believe we are animals to be whipped. They believe we will accept their yoke because they have built roads and towns on our lands. They believe we have forgotten how to fight." She paced the circle, meeting each tribal leader's eyes. "But we remember. Our ancestors drove back Julius Caesar himself. We are the children of Britannia, and this island's soil runs in our blood." A Trinovantian chief spoke up. "The Romans have taken everything from us. Our lands, our gods, our dignity. Then we shall take everything from them," Boudica replied. "Not just their lives, but their very presence on our island. We will erase them so completely that future generations will wonder if they were ever here at all." She outlined her plan. They would strike first at Camulodunum, the colony of retired legionaries who had treated the local tribes with particular contempt. The settlement was lightly defended, its walls incomplete. From there, they would move on Londinium, the heart of Roman commerce, and then Verulamium, where wealthy Roman citizens had built their villas on stolen land. "And what of Paulinus and his legions?" asked an elder Iceni warrior. "He is in the west, slaughtering druids on Mona," Boudica answered. "By the time he returns, half of Roman Britain will be ashes. He will face not just the Iceni, but every tribe from here to the Western Sea." The gathering erupted in shouts of approval. Warriors banged spears against shields. Some wept openly at the prospect of vengeance. But it was what Boudica did next that sealed her place as more than just another tribal leader. She called for her war chariot and had it driven into the roundhouse itself. Standing on its platform, she raised her arms. "I do not fight for the Iceni throne," she declared. "I fight as Britannia herself. I am a mother whose daughters were defiled. I am a queen whose sovereignty was mocked. I am every one of you who has suffered Roman injustice." She drew her sword, its edge catching the firelight. "I swear by Andraste, goddess of victory, that I will not cut my hair until Roman blood has washed this blade clean. I will lead you against them, but know this, I am no general plotting safely behind the lines. I will be in the front rank. I will kill Romans with my own hands." The assembly exploded. Warriors who had hesitated to follow a woman now dropped to their knees. By sunrise the next day, word had spread throughout the tribes. Boudica's army swelled beyond counting. Farmers brought scythes and pitchforks. Hunters brought bows and spears. Warriors arrived with swords, shields, and the distinctive long Celtic spears that could outreach even Roman pila. And they brought their fury, decades of accumulated hatred for the invaders who had stolen their lands, violated their customs, and treated them like animals in their own country. When the horde moved toward Camulodunum, it was like nothing Britain had ever seen. Not an army in the Roman sense, with its rigid organization and tactical precision, but a human flood, men, women, even children trailing behind, all united in their determination to cleanse their island of the Roman presence. At their head rode Boudica in her chariot, her daughters beside her, copper hair streaming in the wind. The wheels carried sharp scythes designed to cut down infantry. As they approached Camulodunum, its inhabitants could hear the terrible noise from miles away. Not the measured cadence of Roman legions on the march, but the primal roar of an entire people rising against their oppressors. The colonists at Camulodunum had received warnings, but dismissed them. These were just barbarians after all. Savages who painted their bodies blue and worshipped trees. Surely they would not dare attack Roman citizens. It was the last mistake many of them would ever make. Boudica's revolt, the symbolism of the Temple of Claudius. The Temple of Claudius in Camulodunum was meant to be eternal. Built of gleaming white stone imported from across the empire, it stood as a symbol of Roman permanence in Britain. A massive statue of the deified emperor dominated the interior, surrounded by the paraphernalia of Roman state religion. To the natives, it represented something else entirely, a monument to their subjugation, built with their forced labor and maintained by crushing taxation. When Boudica's horde crashed against Camulodunum's incomplete defenses, the temple became the colonists' last refuge. Several hundred Romans, mostly veterans, their families, and a handful of merchants, barricaded themselves inside, certain that its thick walls would protect them until help arrived. For 2 days they held out. From the temple roof, they watched in horror as the rest of the settlement burned. Elegant villas with their mosaic floors and heated baths, warehouses filled with Italian wine and Spanish olive oil, shops selling Gaulish pottery and Syrian glass, all went up in flames. The imported luxuries that had made colonial life bearable became fuel for the inferno. On the third morning, the temple doors gave way. What followed was not combat, but slaughter. The veterans fought bravely, but they were old men facing overwhelming numbers. Women and children huddled behind the altar, praying to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. None were spared. When it was over, Boudica ordered the temple dismantled stone by stone. The statue of Claudius was decapitated, its bronze head taken as a trophy. The British warriors, many of whom had been forced to work on the temple's construction, took particular pleasure in reducing it to rubble. "Leave nothing standing," Boudica commanded. "Let the wind blow through empty spaces where Romans once walked." The only Roman response came from Petilius Cerialis and the 9th Legion. Stationed at Lindum Colonia, modern Lincoln, they marched south as soon as word reached them. But Cerialis, an inexperienced commander, made the catastrophic error of underestimating his enemy. Instead of waiting for reinforcements, he pushed his 2,000 legionaries hard through territory already in revolt. Boudica's scouts spotted the Roman column while it was still miles from Camulodunum. She set her trap in a narrow wooded valley, concealing thousands of warriors among the trees. As the exhausted legionaries marched into the ambush, British chariots suddenly blocked the road ahead and behind. Then the main force descended from the hillsides. The legionaries tried to form their standard defensive formation, a rectangle with shields locked, but there was no time, no room to maneuver. The British tribesmen, fighting on their home soil, swarmed around the broken Roman units. Cerialis watched helplessly as his infantry was surrounded and cut to pieces. Only the cavalry managed to break out, Cerialis among them, fleeing back toward Lindum. When a blood-spattered messenger reached Londinium with news of the 9th's destruction, panic swept through the settlement. Londinium was not yet the major city it would later become, but it was already the province's commercial heart. Some 30,000 people, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and their families from across the empire, had made it their home. Unlike Camulodunum, it had no walls, no defensive structures of any kind. It relied entirely on the general peace that Roman rule had brought to southeast Britain. That peace was now shattered. As rumors spread of Boudica's approach, the settlement's more wealthy inhabitants began fleeing. They loaded wagons with valuables and headed south toward the coast, hoping to find ships that could carry them to Gaul. Others, who had invested everything in Londinium's prosperity, chose to stay and pray for Roman reinforcements. Their prayers were answered, but not as they hoped. Suetonius Paulinus arrived with a small cavalry escort, having ridden ahead of his main force. What he found appalled him: a defenseless civilian population in the direct path of an overwhelming enemy force. The military calculus was brutal but clear. Even if his legions arrived in time, trying to defend Londinium would be suicidal. The settlement sprawled across both banks of the Thames, impossible to secure with the troops available. Fighting there would mean the destruction of his army, and with it, any hope of preserving Roman Britain. In the forum, Paulinus addressed the settlement's leaders. "I cannot defend this place," he told them bluntly. "Those who can should evacuate immediately. Head south toward Novia Megas Reginorum. My troops will provide escort for one day's march, no more. And those who cannot travel," asked a merchant whose warehouses represented his life's work. Paulinus's face might have been carved from stone. "Then pray to whatever gods you believe in." As the governor departed with his escort and those civilians able to flee, Londinium braced for the inevitable. Some committed suicide rather than face what was coming. Others barricaded themselves in stone buildings, knowing the futility of such measures. Many simply drank themselves into a stupor, determined to meet death with numbed senses. Boudica's arrival was heralded by a pall of smoke, visible for miles. Her army had grown still larger after the victory over the 9th, swollen with warriors from every tribe with grievances against Rome. They fell upon Londinium with a fury born of generations of resentment. Archaeological evidence tells the rest of the story. A thick layer of red ash, still visible in excavations beneath modern London, marks the time when Boudica's warriors put the settlement to the torch. The fire burned so hot that clay bricks melted and roof tiles warped. Human remains found in this layer show evidence of decapitation, dismemberment, and in some cases, ritual killing. Londinium, the proud trading centre that symbolized the prosperity Rome had brought to Britain, was erased in a single day of violence. Those inhabitants who had not fled were killed without regard to age or gender. Buildings were systematically looted, then burned. Even the wooden bridge across the Thames was destroyed, its charred pilings left jutting from the river like broken teeth. Verulamium, modern St. Albans suffered the same fate days later. Once a prosperous British settlement that had embraced Roman ways, it had become a town of fine villas and temples. Here lived the native aristocracy who had collaborated with Rome, adopting Roman dress, Roman names, and Roman customs. To Boudica's followers, they were the worst traitors of all. The town's destruction was particularly methodical. Archaeologists have found evidence that buildings were not simply burned, but dismantled. Mosaic floors were smashed with hammers. Statues were defaced, their heads removed. It was not just killing. It was the systematic erasure of Roman culture from British soil. As the smoke from Verulamium rose into the summer sky, Boudica gathered her commanders. 3 major Roman settlements lay in ruins. Tens of thousands of Romans and their British allies were dead. The bronze head of Emperor Claudius had been tossed into a river as an offering to native gods. For the first time since the invasion 18 years earlier, the southeast of Britain was free of Roman control. But Boudica knew the war had only just begun. Paulinus was still at large with his legions. More Roman forces would come from Gaul if needed. The empire would not surrender Britain without a fight to the death. "We have wounded the beast," she told her tribal chiefs. "Now we must kill it before it recovers." The Battle of Watling Street, Suetonius Paulinus's defining moment. Suetonius Paulinus stood alone on a rise overlooking the narrow valley, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. In his 25 years of military service, he had chosen many battlefields, but none would define his legacy like this one. The position along Watling Street was perfect, a natural bottleneck between densely wooded hills that would neutralize the Britons' overwhelming numerical advantage. "They'll have no choice but to funnel through the center," he murmured to himself, mentally placing his formations on the field below. The woods behind his position provided additional security. No enemy could circle behind without becoming disorganized in the thick forest, and the trees offered a final retreat position if the impossible happened. His 2 legions, the Archaeological Gemina and XX Valeria Victrix, had arrived the previous day, marching with the relentless efficiency that had made Rome master of the known world. 8,000 legionaries, supplemented by 2,000 auxiliaries, now prepared for battle according to procedures perfected over centuries of warfare. This was not an army. It was a machine, each man a component engineered for a specific function. Nearby, the legion's engineers had worked through the night, subtly altering the landscape to Rome's advantage. Shallow trenches were dug and disguised with brush. The ground in front of the Roman position was cleared of obstacles that might disrupt their formation. Every detail mattered when facing an enemy that outnumbered you more than 20 to 1. Behind him, a horseman approached, Marcus Galerius, his most trusted centurion, a man who had risen from the ranks and fought alongside Paulinus in 3 provinces. "The scouts report Boudica's force is less than 5 miles away," Galerius reported. "They're moving slower now, burdened with plunder and captives." Paulinus nodded. "And their numbers?" Galerius hesitated. "At least 200,000. Perhaps more." "Not all warriors. There are women, children, wagons. They're bringing everything, as if this is their final battle." "It will be," Paulinus replied. He turned to face his officer, his expression granite. "Are the men ready?" "They know what faces them," Galerius answered carefully. "Some are afraid, naturally. But they're Romans. They'll hold." The unspoken question hung between them. Would Roman discipline be enough against such overwhelming odds? No Roman commander in Britain had ever faced a native force of this size. The disaster that befell the 9th Legion still haunted the troops. Paulinus's gaze swept across the valley once more. "Have the men eat well and rest. I'll address them before deployment." As Galerius departed, Paulinus allowed himself a moment of brutal honesty. Today would end with either his greatest triumph or his complete destruction. There would be no middle outcome, no honorable retreat. If his line broke, the British would slaughter every Roman to the last man. The Roman camp hummed with controlled activity. Legionaries sharpened swords and checked the straps on their shields. Javelin tips were inspected for flaws. Armor was adjusted and readjusted. Some men wrote final letters home, knowing they might never leave this valley. Unlike the chaotic British camp, where warriors worked themselves into a frenzy with ritual, alcohol, and war songs, the Romans prepared in near silence. Their discipline extended beyond the battlefield to every aspect of their existence. As the sun climbed higher, Paulinus summoned his officers. They gathered in the command tent, centurions and auxiliary prefects representing units from across the empire, Gauls, Spaniards, Batavians, Thracians, all serving under Rome's eagle. Paulinus's battle plan was simple, but ruthless. The legions would form the center in their traditional close order formation, shields overlapping, creating an impenetrable wall. The auxiliary infantry would strengthen the flanks. Cavalry would be held in reserve, ready to exploit any weakness in the British attack. "They will charge with everything they have," Paulinus told his officers. "They'll expect us to break under the sheer weight of their numbers. We will not. We will hold our ground and let their momentum exhaust itself against our shields. Once they're disorganized and tired, we'll begin the real work." A young tribune raised a hand. "Sir, if I may, they outnumber us by at least 20 to 1. "How can we possibly—" "Numbers," Paulinus interrupted coldly, "are meaningless without discipline. 1 Roman is worth 20 barbarians today. We will prove it." As his officers departed to prepare their units, Paulinus composed in his mind the speech he would deliver to the troops. It would need to be brief. Roman soldiers distrusted flowery rhetoric, but it had to address the fear he knew lurked in every man's heart. 2 hours before midday, the Roman army marched from its camp to the battlefield in perfect formation. 8,000 legionaries in the center, 1,000 auxiliary infantry on each flank, 500 cavalry held in reserve. They took position on the slope facing the open valley, giving them both higher ground and clear visibility of the approaching enemy. The British appeared first as a distant dust cloud, then gradually resolved into a vast, undisciplined mass stretching from horizon to horizon. War chariots led the way, followed by rank upon rank of foot warriors. Behind them came wagons carrying supplies, plunder, and the families of many warriors who had brought their entire households into this campaign. Paulinus rode along the front of his formation, visible to every soldier. When he reached the center, he dismounted and handed the reins to an aide. He would fight on foot, sharing the risks of his men. "Soldiers of Rome," his voice carried across the unnatural silence of the waiting legions. "Look upon them." He gestured toward the approaching British horde. "They are many, but they are rabble. They have no discipline, no order, no plan except to overwhelm us with bodies." He paced slowly before the front rank, making eye contact with as many men as possible. "You are Roman legionaries. Your fathers conquered the world with the same gladius you hold today. Your training, your discipline, your formation, these are the true weapons that have defeated every enemy Rome has faced." He pointed to the narrowing valley. "We have chosen this ground. We have prepared it. They must come to us, through that bottleneck, and dash themselves against our shields. Hold your formation, trust your training, and by sunset, you will have a victory that will be remembered for 1,000 years." A roar went up from the legion shields were banged with sword hilts. Spear butts stamped the ground. For a moment, the noise almost matched the approaching British. Paulinus took his position in the center of the front line. It was where a Roman general belonged in this most desperate hour, not directing from behind, but leading from the front. If his men were to face death, they would see their commander facing it alongside them. The valleys and hills around Watling Street had seen countless travelers over the centuries: merchants, farmers, pilgrims. Now they witnessed the gathering of the largest army Britain had ever assembled. Boudica's chariot, drawn by 2 massive horses, moved through the ranks as her warriors took position. Unlike the Romans, the British had no formal battle order. Tribes clustered together under their own chiefs. Warriors were grouped by family and clan. Their strength lay not in formation, but in individual courage and overwhelming numbers. When she reached the front, Boudica stood tall in her chariot, her copper hair catching the midday sun. She had dressed for this final confrontation in a multicolored tunic, a thick cloak fastened at the shoulder, and the massive gold torque that symbolized her authority. Her daughters flanked her, now armed with daggers, symbols of a nation where every member stood ready to fight. The British warriors fell silent as she addressed them. Her voice, trained to carry across battlefields, reached even the rearmost ranks. "People of Britain, look upon the valley before us. There stands the last remnant of Roman power on our island. A few thousand invaders who dared to enslave us, who flogged your queen, who violated your daughters, who stole your lands and made you strangers in your own country." A howl of rage answered her from thousands of throats. "Today we finish what we began at Camulodunum. Today we cleanse Britain of the Roman disease forever. Today we take back our island." The British began beating weapons against shields, creating a thunderous drumbeat that echoed across the valley. Warriors worked themselves into battle frenzy. Some painted their bodies with blue woad. Others took ritual swigs of alcohol or entheogenic potions prepared by druids. Boudica raised her sword, the signal her chiefs had been waiting for. War horns sounded across the British line. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the earth, the massive horde surged forward toward the tiny Roman formation that stood between them and total victory. The Battle of Watling Street had begun. The Roman war machine. Battle against the British horde. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the 14th Gemina Legion as the British horde surged forward. Lucius Severus, a veteran of 15 years' service, felt the familiar tightening in his gut. Around him, younger legionaries shifted nervously, their knuckles white on sword hilts. 15 battles Severus had survived, from the Rhine to the Danube, yet he had never faced odds like these. "Shields close!" roared the centurion. "Lock formation!" The command rippled down the line. 8,000 legionaries moved as one, raising their curved rectangular shields to create an unbroken wall of painted wood and iron. Their breathing synchronized unconsciously, a phenomenon Roman officers had observed but never fully explained. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, each protecting not just himself, but the man to his right, transformed from individuals into components of a living fortress. This was Rome's true genius. Not its architecture or literature, but its ability to take farmers' sons from Spain, Gaul, and Italy and forge them into the most disciplined fighting force the world had ever seen. "Hold steady," the centurion called, his voice unnaturally calm. "Remember your training." Training! The word echoed in Severus's mind. 8 hours of drill every day for months before a recruit even touched a real weapon. Marching 20 miles with 60-pound packs, then building a fortified camp before sleeping. Mock battles fought with wooden swords weighted heavier than real ones. Endless repetition until every movement became instinct. Behind their shield wall, the front rank could now clearly see the approaching British. Unlike the Romans in their identical armor, the tribal warriors presented a chaotic spectacle. Some wore elaborate helmets with horns or animal crests. Others had painted their bodies with woad, transforming themselves into blue-skinned demons. They carried a variety of weapons, long Celtic swords designed for slashing, spears, axes, and agricultural tools repurposed for killing. Leading the charge came the British war chariots, lightweight two-wheeled vehicles carrying a driver and warrior. Unlike the heavy chariots of Eastern armies, these were built for mobility, racing along the front line, hurling javelins, then retreating to strike elsewhere. Their wheels featured protruding blades designed to scythe through infantry. "Pila ready!" The order came from Paulinus himself, standing in the center of the front rank. In perfect unison, the first 4 ranks of legionaries drew back their javelins, the iconic Roman throwing spears designed specifically to neutralize enemy advantages. Unlike simple spears, the pilum featured a pyramidal iron head attached to a thin metal shaft, which in turn connected to a wooden handle. Upon impact, this ingenious design bent, making the weapon impossible to throw back. The distance closed. 500 yards. 300. The noise became deafening. Thousands of British warriors screaming battle cries, beating weapons against shields. Paulinus waited until the chariots were committed to their charge, unable to veer away, then dropped his arm. "Release!" The air darkened as thousands of pila arced toward the oncoming British. The front ranks of warriors and chariots disintegrated under the barrage. Those not struck directly found the specialized Roman javelins lodged in their shields, the bent shafts making them unwieldy, forcing many to discard their only protection. But the British momentum could not be stopped by a single volley. Their numbers absorbed the losses, warriors trampling their fallen comrades, the mass of humanity pushing ever forward toward the Roman line. Second volley. Release! Another wave of pila slammed into the British ranks. Horses pulling chariots screamed and fell, sending vehicles tumbling. Warriors tripped over the dead and wounded. The carefully cleared ground before the Roman position became a chaotic tangle of bodies, wreckage, and panicked animals. Then the British wave crashed against the Roman shield wall. The impact sent shockwaves through the legion's formation. Men in the front rank felt the air driven from their lungs as thousands of pounds of human force slammed against their shields. Training took over. They braced their feet, leaned into their shields, and absorbed the pressure, transferring it back through the densely packed ranks behind them. "Hold!" centurions bellowed over the cacophony. "Hold formation!" The British slashed and stabbed at the shield wall, seeking any opening. Finding none, some attempted to climb over, only to be met by the short Roman gladius, the legionaries' primary weapon, designed specifically for the close-quarters fighting of the shield warfare. Unlike the British longswords meant for slashing in open combat, the gladius was a stabbing weapon, perfect for the tight confines of formation fighting. "Thrust!" came the command, and the front rank jabbed their swords forward in unison, aiming for the exposed stomachs and throats of the attackers. Each thrust was economical, extending just far enough to kill before withdrawing behind the shield's protection. "Rotate!" With practiced precision, exhausted front-rank fighters stepped back while fresh men moved forward to take their place, maintaining constant pressure. No other army in the world could execute such maneuvers while engaged in combat. From his position in the fourth rank, Severus caught glimpses of the battle through gaps in the formation. A British warrior, his face contorted in battle frenzy, hurled himself onto the shields, only to receive 3 gladius thrusts simultaneously. A chariot driver whipped his panicked horses, trying to break through before a pilum took him through the chest. The horses, still harnessed to the now driverless vehicle, dragged it sideways, creating further chaos in the British ranks. The initial British attack, for all its fury, began to lose momentum against the unyielding Roman formation. Warriors who reached the front found themselves facing not individual opponents, but an impenetrable wall from which death struck with mechanical efficiency. The British pulled back, regrouped, and attacked again, with renewed vigor. Again they were repulsed. A third wave crashed against the Roman line, this time concentrated on the left flank where auxiliary infantry held position. Paulinus, watching from the center, recognized the danger immediately. If the auxiliaries broke, the entire formation would be compromised. He dispatched runners to the cavalry commander, held in reserve. Reinforce the left flank. Strike their rear as they commit to the attack. 500 Roman and Batavian cavalry, held in check until this precise moment, suddenly thundered from behind the Roman position. Rather than engaging the main British force head-on, they curved around and struck the flank of the warriors, pressing the Roman left. The unexpected attack from an unanticipated direction sent panic through British ranks, already disorganized by their own assault. As the battle entered its second hour, a pattern emerged. The British would gather themselves, charge with overwhelming numbers, then break against the disciplined Roman defense. Each attack sapped British energy and morale, while costing the Romans relatively few casualties. The valley floor became increasingly treacherous with fallen warriors, broken weapons, and blood-slicked grass, further hampering British mobility. What the British could not understand, what no enemy of Rome fully comprehended until faced with it directly, was that they were not fighting individual Romans. They were fighting Rome itself, its centuries of military evolution, its ruthlessly efficient systems crystallized in human form. Each legionary was a product of the most sophisticated military machine, yet created, trained to function as part of a greater whole, rather than as an individual hero. From her chariot behind the British front line, Boudica watched with growing alarm. Her warriors fought with unmatched courage, but courage alone could not break the Roman formation. Hundreds, then thousands of British lay dead or wounded, while the Roman line remained unbroken. She summoned her tribal chiefs for a final desperate gamble. "Gather every warrior," she commanded. "We attack their center with everything we have. Forget the flanks. If we break through Paulinus himself, their formation will collapse." As the British prepared for this final push, Paulinus sensed the shift in tactics. With the instincts born from decades of warfare, he reinforced his center, tightening the formation and bringing up his last reserves. "They come for the eagle," he told his officers, referring to the sacred standard of the legion. "They come for me." This is where we end it. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its descent toward the western hills. The final act of the battle was about to begin. Boudica's final stand. Boudica's chariot carved a path through her own warriors as she moved to lead the final assault. The magnificent vehicle, its sides adorned with tribal symbols and its wheels fitted with lethal scythes, had become a rallying point for the British forces. Now she would use it as the spearhead for one last, desperate attempt to break the Roman line. "To me," she cried, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "Warriors of Britain, to me!" The response was immediate. Around her chariot gathered the elite fighters of a dozen tribes, men who had sworn blood oaths to die before retreating, warriors whose bodies were covered in the ritual scars of battle honors. Many were already wounded, but fought on through a combination of battle frenzy and the numbing effects of the alcoholic beverages they had consumed before combat. "We strike at their center," Boudica told them, pointing with her blood-streaked sword toward the spot where Paulinus's crimson cloak marked his position. "Kill their leader, and the rest will break." This was not mere optimism. Boudica had studied Roman warfare enough to understand that while the legion's strength came from their collective discipline, they were still human. Cut off the head, and the body might die. It had happened before in Roman defeats against Germanic tribes and Parthian armies. Her own daughters, now armed and blooded from the day's fighting, took positions flanking her chariot. Since their violation by Roman soldiers, they had transformed from royal children into symbols of British vengeance. Their presence reminded every warrior what they were fighting for, not just abstract freedom, but protection of their families from Roman atrocities. "When I charge," Boudica instructed, "follow directly behind my chariot. It will create a wedge in their line. Push through that opening with everything you have." She turned to the charioteer, a grizzled warrior who had driven royal war chariots for 3 kings. "Straight for the Roman governor. Do not turn aside for anything." The man nodded grimly. Both knew this was likely a one-way journey. As preparations for this final assault continued, an unexpected problem developed behind the British front lines. The vast baggage train, Thousands of wagons containing plunder from the sacked Roman settlements, supplies, and the families of many warriors had inched forward during the battle. Now it formed a crescent around the rear of the fighting forces, effectively blocking any route of retreat. This had not been part of Boudica's plan. The British tribes, flush with their earlier victories and convinced of Roman weakness, had brought their entire households to witness what they assumed would be their final triumph. Now those same families and wagons formed a trap of their own making. None of this concerned the Queen, as she readied for her charge. In her mind there was no retreat, no tomorrow. There was only victory or death. On the Roman side, Paulinus had recognized the signs of an impending all-out assault on his center. He called forward the Praetorian cohort, elite guards assigned to protect the governor, and positioned them directly around himself and the legion's eagle standard. "They will come for this," he said, touching the silver eagle that represented not just the legion, but Rome itself. "And for me. When they do, we must be ready." To his centurions, he issued specific orders. Tighten the formation. First rank kneeling, shields braced. Second rank shields overlapping above. When I give the signal, the front opens just long enough for the third and fourth ranks to release Pila. Immediately reform before they reach us. The maneuver he described was among the most difficult in the Roman tactical repertoire, opening the seemingly solid shield wall for a devastating volley, then closing it again before the enemy could exploit the momentary weakness. It required split-second timing and absolute trust in one's comrades. But if executed perfectly, it could break the back of even the most determined charge. As his men made final adjustments to their positions, Paulinus took a moment to survey the battlefield. The valley floor was carpeted with British dead and wounded. Roman casualties were light by comparison, perhaps a few hundred killed or seriously wounded, mostly among the auxiliary units on the flanks. The main legionary formation remained largely intact. But the governor was experienced enough to know that battles could turn in an instant. One breakdown in discipline, one moment of panic, and his outnumbered force could still be overwhelmed. "Here they come," his senior centurion reported, pointing toward movement in the British lines. Paulinus nodded. "Pass the word. Brace for impact." The final British charge began with a moment of eerie silence. The constant screaming and clashing of weapons that had filled the valley all day suddenly diminished as warriors gathered themselves for this last effort. Then Boudica's voice cut through the quiet. "For Britain! For freedom!" Her chariot lurched forward, quickly building speed as it rumbled down the gentle slope toward the Roman center. Behind her came thousands of warriors, no longer organized by tribe, but united in a single massive wedge formation with the Queen's chariot at its tip. The Romans watched the approaching wave with the steady gaze of professional soldiers. Hands tightened on sword hilts, boots shifted for better bracing, shields were adjusted to eliminate any gap in the wall. When the British charge reached the halfway point, Paulinus gave his first command, "Pila ready!" The third and fourth ranks prepared their javelins, drawing them back in perfect unison. The distance closed rapidly, 400 yards. 300, 200, formation open. With drill ground precision, the front ranks created a narrow channel in the shield wall, just wide enough for the waiting Pila to launch through. Release! A storm of javelins arced toward the oncoming British, focusing specifically on the area around Boudica's chariot. Several struck the vehicle itself, one impaling the charioteer through the chest. Others brought down the horses, sending the chariot tumbling forward in a tangle of wood, metal, and flesh. "Close formation," Paulinus bellowed, and the shield wall snapped shut just as the British vanguard, momentarily leaderless with Boudica's chariot disabled, slammed into it. For a critical moment, the charge lost momentum. Warriors who had been following directly behind the Queen's vehicle found themselves stumbling over its wreckage. The carefully planned wedge formation began to dissolve into a general press of bodies. But Boudica herself was not so easily stopped. Though thrown from the chariot, she rose from the ground, bloodied but unbowed. Her copper hair now matted with dirt and blood, she raised her sword and continued forward on foot. "Follow me!" she screamed above the din of battle. "Follow your queen!" The sight of their leader, seemingly invincible, restored British courage. The charge resumed with renewed fury, crashing against the Roman line like a wave against a seawall. This time, however, something different happened. Whether through the sheer weight of numbers or the desperate courage of warriors who knew this was their final chance, the British began to make small, localized breakthroughs. In several places, individual Romans were dragged from the formation and quickly overwhelmed. Paulinus, seeing the danger, committed his final reserves: the Praetorian cohort that had been guarding his person and the eagle. These elite soldiers moved forward to reinforce the weakening points in the line. The battle reached its crescendo. In the center, where Boudica herself led the assault, British warriors began to climb over their own dead, creating human ramps that allowed them to attack the Romans from above. A dangerous bulge formed in the Roman line as pressure mounted. It was the pivotal moment that would determine the outcome of not just the battle, but the entire British rebellion. If the Roman center collapsed now, the flanks would quickly follow, and Paulinus's army would be annihilated. The governor recognized the crisis and made a fateful decision. Rather than retreating to preserve his forces, he advanced. "Forward," he ordered, placing himself at the very front of the threatened section. "Push them back." The unexpected Roman advance caught the British by surprise. Warriors who had been pressing forward suddenly found themselves being pushed backward by the disciplined weight of the legionary formation. Paulinus himself fought in the front rank, his sword rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a man who had spent decades mastering his craft. The Roman advance created space, alleviating the dangerous pressure on their center. In that space, the legionaries could once again employ their greatest advantage: disciplined, formation-based fighting that allowed each man to kill with maximum efficiency while remaining protected by his comrades' shields. Boudica, recognizing the danger, tried desperately to rally her warriors for one more push. She fought her way to within a few yards of Paulinus himself, close enough that the two leaders locked eyes across the chaotic battlefield. In that brief moment, history hung in the balance. Two commanders, representing radically different worlds and values, each staking everything on this single confrontation. Then a Roman pilum struck Boudica in the shoulder, the force of it driving her to one knee blood poured from the wound, but still she tried to rise, to continue the fight. Around her, British warriors who had seemed endless in number now began to waver. The Romans sensed the shift and pressed their advantage. The legionary formation advanced step by step, shields locked, swords stabbing with ruthless efficiency. There was no mercy, no quarter offered. This was not just combat. It was Roman retribution for burned settlements and slaughtered civilians. The British line bent, then broke. What began as a controlled withdrawal quickly degenerated into a rout as tribal cohesion dissolved. Warriors who had charged forward with such confidence now turned and fled, only to discover the fatal trap they had laid for themselves. The wagons and families that had crowded behind the British lines now blocked their retreat. As panic spread, the narrow exits became bottlenecks where fleeing warriors trampled each other in their desperation to escape. Paulinus, seeing victory within his grasp, committed his final card. The Roman and Batavian cavalry, which had been held in reserve since its earlier flanking maneuver, now charged into the disorganized British mass. Mounted on larger horses and armored for shock combat, these professional horsemen cut through the fleeing tribesmen like a scythe through wheat. What followed was not battle but slaughter. Roman sources claim that 80,000 British were killed against only 400 Roman casualties. While these numbers were likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes, modern historians agree that the British losses were catastrophic, perhaps the most one-sided defeat in the history of Celtic resistance to Rome. As darkness began to fall over the valley of Watling Street, Boudica disappeared from the battlefield, carried away by her remaining bodyguards. The great rebellion that had threatened to expel Rome from Britain had been broken in a single day through the application of professional military discipline against overwhelming but disorganized numbers. Paulinus, standing amid the carnage as his officers reported the extent of their victory, knew that Roman control of Britain had been saved. But he also knew the cost: 3 major settlements destroyed, tens of thousands of Roman citizens and allies killed, and an entire province that would now have to be subjugated anew. The Battle of Watling Street was over. The bloody work of reconquest was about to begin. Against all odds, the aftermath of Paulinus's triumph. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed by slaughter. The valley that had witnessed history's most lopsided victory now resembled an open grave. Roman burial details moved methodically through fields of British dead, not to inter them, but to strip them of anything valuable. Roman burial details moved methodically through fields of British dead, not to inter them, but to strip them of anything valuable. Gold torques, silver brooches, weapons with decorated hilts, all were collected as spoils of war and would eventually be paraded through Rome as evidence of Paulinus's triumph. In the Roman camp, physicians attended to the wounded, prioritizing officers and then working their way down through the ranks. Their techniques, developed over centuries of warfare, were surprisingly sophisticated. Wounds were cleaned with vinegar, bleeding vessels cauterized with hot irons, and bandages soaked in herbal infusions applied to prevent infection. Those with limbs too damaged to save faced amputation performed with bone saws and specialized surgical tools. Despite their victory, the atmosphere among the Romans was subdued. There was none of the raucous celebration that typically followed battle. These men had faced annihilation, had stared into an abyss of barbarian fury unlike anything in living memory. Their survival felt less like triumph and more like divine intervention. "The final count?" Paulinus asked his chief centurion as they walked through the camp. "The final count?" Paulinus asked his chief centurion as they walked through the camp. 372 dead, sir, perhaps twice that wounded, though most will recover." Paulinus nodded. Less than a tenth of his force lost. A miracle by any military standard when facing such overwhelming odds. And the British? At least 40,000 dead on the field. Many more died in the rout. We found entire families slaughtered in their wagons, trampled by their own people as they fled. The governor's face remained impassive, but inwardly he felt a cold satisfaction. The governor's face remained impassive, but inwardly he felt a cold satisfaction. This was Roman justice, merciless, absolute, and proportionate to the offense. The rebels had massacred Roman civilians at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Now they had paid the price in blood. What of Boudica? No sign of her body. Sir, our scouts report a small party of mounted warriors broke through to the north. She may have been among them. Paulinus considered this information carefully. A living Boudica might become a rallying point for further resistance. Dead, she would be a useful symbol of Rome's inevitable triumph over barbarism. Double the reward for her capture, he ordered. I want her in chains before the month is out. 60 miles north of the battlefield, in a small forest clearing, Boudica lay dying. The pilum that had struck her during the battle had penetrated deeper than initially apparent. Though her warriors had managed to break the shaft, the iron head remained lodged near her lung, causing internal bleeding that no tribal healer could stop. Around her gathered the remnants of her royal guard and her 2 daughters. They had fled through the night, evading Roman patrols, knowing that capture would mean being paraded through Rome before public execution. "We should have died on the field," one of her daughters said, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "We should have charged again." Boudica shook her head weakly. "And given Rome the satisfaction, no. They will find no body to desecrate, no head to place on a spike." She coughed, blood speckling her lips. "Listen carefully. What I ask now requires the greatest courage." She beckoned her most trusted warrior closer and whispered instructions. The man's face paled, but he nodded grimly. From a pouch at his belt, he produced a small clay vial, poison extracted from yew berries, carried by tribal leaders specifically for situations when capture seemed inevitable. Boudica took the vial with steady hands. "This is not defeat," she told her daughters. "This is freedom. The only kind Romans cannot take from us." With ritual dignity, she drank the poison, then passed the vial to her daughters. One by one, they followed their mother's example. "Let it be known," Boudica said as the poison began its work, "that the Queen of the Iceni chose her own end. Let the tribes remember that we stood against Rome when no one else dared, and let our gods welcome us as warriors who never surrendered. Within the hour, all were dead." The loyal guardsmen buried them in an unmarked location, then scattered to distant parts of Britain, carrying the truth of Boudica's end to trusted members of the remaining tribes. No Roman would ever find her body. The mystery of her fate would enter Celtic legend, eventually transformed by oral tradition into stories of magical escape and promises of future return in Britain's darkest hour. 2 days after the battle, Paulinus convened his war council. The senior officers of the Operative and the 28th legions gathered in his tent, along with the commanders of auxiliary units and the few surviving officials of Britain's Roman administration. "Gentlemen," the governor began, "we have won a great victory, but our work has only begun." He unrolled a map of Britain on the central table. The southeast lies in ruins. 3 major settlements destroyed, thousands of Roman citizens murdered, the provincial economy shattered. We must rebuild, but first we must ensure this can never happen again. What followed was a strategy session that would determine the fate of Britain for generations to come. Paulinus outlined a plan of systematic retribution against any tribe suspected of supporting Boudica villages, would be burned, leaders executed, and populations relocated. The British would learn that rebellion against Rome brought consequences beyond imagination. "Sir," a young tribune interjected, "with respect, such measures might only create more hatred. Perhaps clemency—" "Clemency?" Paulinus cut him off. Was there clemency at Camulodunum? Did the rebels show mercy to the women and children they butchered in Londinium? He swept his hand across the map. This is not Greece or Gaul, where we conquered civilized peoples who could be assimilated. These are savages who paint themselves blue and worship trees. They understand only force. Not all present agreed with this assessment, but none dared contradict the governor further. His victory at Watling Street had made him untouchable, at least for the moment. As the council disbanded, one officer remained behind. Marcus Trebellius Maximus recently arrived from Rome as an imperial observer. "A word, Governor?" Trebellius asked once they were alone. Paulinus nodded curtly. He had little regard for political appointees, especially those sent to monitor his actions. "Your victory was magnificent," Trebellius began diplomatically. "Emperor Nero will certainly grant you triumphal honors when the news reaches Rome." "But," Paulinus sensed the qualification coming, "but there are concerns about your approach to pacification. The emperor believes Britain should be a profitable province, not a constant drain on the treasury. Endless warfare benefits no one." Paulinus's expression hardened. "I did not save this province through negotiation, Trebellius. I saved it with Roman steel. The same steel that will ensure it remains Roman." Perhaps the imperial observer conceded. Yet consider this. Why did this rebellion occur at all? After 18 years of occupation, why did the Iceni and other client kingdoms suddenly turn against us? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its implication. Both men knew the answer, though neither would speak it directly. Roman mismanagement, corruption, and brutality had created the conditions for revolt. "I have my orders," Paulinus said finally. "Pacify the province." "That is what I intend to do." Trebellius bowed slightly. "Of course, Governor. I merely offer perspective from Rome. The emperor wants peace and prosperity, not an endless cycle of rebellion and repression." After the observer departed, Paulinus remained alone with his thoughts. His military instincts demanded harsh reprisals against the rebellious tribes. Yet he was experienced enough to recognize the political reality. His approach might soon fall out of favor in Rome, especially if it proved costly. The irony did not escape him. He had achieved perhaps the most remarkable victory in Rome's military history, defeating an enemy that outnumbered him more than 20-1. Yet that same victory might ultimately lead to his recall and replacement by men who favored diplomacy over discipline. Such were the complexities of serving Rome. The battlefield, with its clear delineations between victory and defeat, life and death, was in many ways simpler than the political machinations that followed. The next morning, Paulinus led his legions northeast toward the heartland of the Iceni tribe. The Roman column moved with the same disciplined efficiency it had displayed in battle, 8,000 men marching in formation, supply wagons and artillery following in precise order, cavalry scouting ahead. This was Rome's true power on display, not just the ability to win battles, but to sustain continuous military operations over vast distances each night. The legions constructed a fortified camp according to standardized plans. Each morning, they broke camp and resumed the march with mechanical precision. It was this relentless, methodical approach that had conquered the known world. The lands they marched through bore witness to the recent conflict. Villages stood abandoned, their inhabitants fled at the approach of Roman vengeance, fields lay untended, livestock scattered. The British tribes, having staked everything on Boudica's rebellion, now faced the consequences of failure. After 4 days of marching, the column reached the principal settlement of the Iceni. Paulinus had expected resistance, a desperate last stand by the remaining warriors of the tribe. Instead, they found only empty roundhouses and smouldering hearth fires. The population had vanished into the forests and wetlands, preferring harsh survival in the wilderness to Roman captivity. "Burn it all," Paulinus ordered, "then salt the fields." As flames consumed the abandoned tribal center, the governor stood watching with cold satisfaction. This was how Rome secured its frontiers, not just by defeating enemies, but by eliminating their very ability to resist in the future. Yet as he watched the fire spread, a strange unease settled over him. He had won a victory that would be studied for centuries. He had saved Roman Britain from annihilation. He had executed his duty with perfect military precision. Why then did triumph taste so hollow? Perhaps because in his innermost thoughts, Paulinus recognized an uncomfortable truth. Boudica had very nearly succeeded. Her rebellion had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Roman control of Britain, the overextension of military forces, the corruption of the provincial administration, the simmering resentment of native populations. One different decision, a different choice of battlefield, a moment of wavering in the Roman line, a less experienced commander, and the outcome might have been reversed. History, Paulinus knew, often hung on such slender threads. As night fell and the fires of the Iceni settlement burned down to embers, the governor retired to his tent and began composing his official report to Rome. In it, he would describe his great victory in appropriately modest terms, emphasizing the courage of his men rather than his own leadership. He would not mention his private doubts, nor the fact that Britain, though nominally pacified, would require a permanent garrison of 3 legions, a tenth of Rome's entire military strength, for generations to come. Some victories, Paulinus reflected as he wrote, carried the seeds of future conflicts within them. The Battle of Watling Street had saved Roman Britain, but it had also demonstrated that the island would never be truly Roman in spirit. That was the final bitter irony of his triumph. Having defeated Boudica's army, he had ensured that Rome would remain in Britain for another 3 centuries, centuries of constant vigilance against a people who would never fully surrender their dream of freedom. Aftermath and legacy of Rome's triumph. Rome celebrated victory with characteristic extravagance. In the Forum, heralds announced the news of Paulinus's triumph over savage hordes, threatening a valuable province. The Senate decreed special games in honor of the victory. Poets composed verses celebrating Roman arms, prevailing against barbarian chaos. None mentioned how close the empire had come to losing Britain entirely. Away from the public festivities, in the chambers where real power resided, a different conversation unfolded. Nero, now 5 years into his reign, received the official report from Britannia with mixed emotions. The victory was welcome, but the rebellion itself raised uncomfortable questions about provincial management. "Tell me," the emperor asked his advisors, "why were these tribes not properly pacified after 18 years of occupation?" The question hung unanswered. Few wished to speak the obvious truth, that Roman procurators in Britain had been rapacious beyond prudence, treating allied kingdoms as conquered territories to be exploited rather than cultivated. Perhaps, ventured Seneca, the emperor's tutor and advisor, a change in approach is warranted. The cost of maintaining 3 full legions in Britain exceeds the revenue from the province. Might a more conciliatory policy prove economical? Nero nodded thoughtfully. Despite his later reputation for madness, in 61 CE, the young emperor was still capable of rational governance when it aligned with his interests. Britain's value lay in its resources and prestige, not in endless military campaigns against its native population. Recall Paulinus, he decided. Honor him appropriately for his victory, but replace him with someone less martial in temperament. The decision surprised no one familiar with imperial politics. Military heroes often found themselves diplomatically removed from power before their popularity became threatening. Julius Classicianus, a Romanized Gaul with experience in managing frontier provinces, was dispatched to Britain as the new procurator with instructions to pursue a policy of reconciliation. The recall notice reached Paulinus 6 weeks later as he was systematically burning his way through tribal territories in central Britain. The governor received it with stoic resignation, recognizing the familiar pattern he had won the war but would not be permitted to dictate the peace. 8 months after the Battle of Watling Street, Paulinus departed Britain aboard a merchant galley bound for Gaul. From the stern deck, he watched the white cliffs recede into the distance. He would return to Rome, receive his honors, likely a minor triumph rather than the full ceremony, and be assigned to some safe administrative position where his military talents could neither threaten the emperor nor reshape provincial policy. As Britain disappeared over the horizon, the general permitted himself a rare moment of reflection. Had the rebellion been preventable, could better administration, more respectful treatment of client kingdoms, have maintained Roman control without bloodshed? Perhaps, but such thoughts belonged to politicians, not soldiers. Rome had given him a task, save the province, and he had executed it with brutal efficiency. History would judge the methods, but none could question the results. In Britain, the scars of Boudica's rebellion transformed the landscape, both physically and politically. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were rebuilt, but archaeological evidence reveals a clear Boudican destruction layer, a stratum of burnt debris, melted glass, and human remains that marks this violent interruption in Roman urban development. The Romans learned from the near-disaster military presence was strengthened throughout the province. The Epirthov Legion received the honorary title Martia Victrix, martial and victorious, for its role in defeating Boudica. New forts were established at strategic locations. Roman civilians began constructing homes with defensive capabilities, a tacit acknowledgement that the province remained potentially hostile territory. Julius Classicianus, the new procurator, pursued a markedly different approach than his predecessors. His tombstone, discovered in the ruins of Roman London, describes a man who restored the province to peace. Archaeological evidence supports this characterization, showing increased trade and construction in the decades following the rebellion. For the tribes of Britain, Watling Street marked a decisive turning point. The devastating defeat broke the military power of the southeastern tribes permanently. Never again would they mount a unified challenge to Roman rule. Resistance continued in the mountainous west and north, but the heartland of what would become England gradually accommodated itself to Roman presence. Yet Boudica was not forgotten. Despite Roman efforts to erase her memory, her story survived through oral tradition in British tribal culture. As classical learning faded during the post-Roman period, her legend transformed, becoming increasingly mythologized with each retelling. "And this is where it happened," the tourist guide announced, gesturing toward an unremarkable stretch of English countryside near modern Manchester. Somewhere in this valley, a vastly outnumbered Roman force defeated Boudica's massive army through superior tactics and discipline. The small group of tourists looked around skeptically. Nothing about the peaceful landscape suggested the slaughter that had occurred here nearly 2 millennia earlier. No monuments marked the site of one of history's most lopsided military encounters. "How do we know this is actually the spot?" asked an American woman, camera poised expectantly. "Shouldn't there be, I don't know, artifacts or something?" The guide smiled patiently. The exact location remains debated among historians. Tacitus and Dio Cassius described the battle, but didn't specify precisely where it took place. Archaeological evidence is sparse. Roman military operations were remarkably clean compared to modern warfare. They collected their dead, gathered up weapons and equipment, and moved on. He gestured toward the rolling hills. "What we do know is that Paulinus chose his ground brilliantly, a narrow valley with forested hills protecting his flanks, forcing Boudica's superior numbers into a bottleneck where they couldn't be effectively deployed." The tourists nodded, trying to visualize the ancient battle on this ordinary-looking landscape. One man, a retired military officer, surveyed the terrain with more informed interest. "The principles haven't changed much, have they?" he remarked. "Force, multipliers, terrain, advantage unit cohesion." What Paulinus did here would still be taught at military academies today. "Absolutely," the guide agreed. "That's why this battle remains so fascinating to military historians. It's perhaps the clearest historical example of how discipline and tactics can overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage." As the group moved back toward their bus, a young woman lingered, staring intently across the valley. "What about Boudica?" she asked when the guide approached. "Did they ever find her body?" "No," the guide replied. "The historical record is unclear about her fate. Tacitus suggests she poisoned herself rather than face capture. Dio Cassius says she fell ill and died. No grave has ever been discovered, which has only added to her mystique over the centuries." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's fitting. The Romans were so methodical, weren't they? Leaving her end mysterious feels like a small victory for her side." The guide considered this perspective. Perhaps. Though Boudica would be surprised by how history has treated her. The Romans tried to erase her from memory, but she's become an enduring British symbol of resistance against oppression. There's a famous statue of her right outside the Houses of Parliament in London. "Ironic," the woman observed. "The Romans won the battle but lost the war for memory." In his study at Cambridge University, Professor James Harrington carefully examined the piece of corroded metal under a magnifying glass. The artifact, recently unearthed during a highway expansion project near Manchester, had the distinctive pyramidal head of a Roman pilum. "Remarkable preservation," he murmured to his research assistant. "And you say this was found with burned material, consistent with a first-century destruction layer?" "Yes, Professor. Carbon dating of the organic material places it right around 60-65 CE. Harrington felt the familiar academic thrill of touching history directly. Could this be a remnant of the decisive battle that saved Roman Britain? The location matched the leading theories about Watling Street's battlefield. The dating aligned perfectly with Boudica's rebellion. "We can't prove it's from the battle, of course," he cautioned, "but it's certainly tantalizing evidence." His assistant nodded. "If it is, it's strange to think that this might have killed one of Boudica's warriors." Harrington carefully returned the artifact to its protective container. "That's the peculiar intimacy of archaeology. We touch these objects and momentarily bridge the gap between our world and theirs. He glanced at the stack of books on his desk. Modern histories, translations of Tacitus and Dio Cassius, archaeological reports spanning decades of research. We keep returning to this story, don't we? Romans and Britons, discipline against fury, the few against the many. Because it's a good story, his assistant suggested. It's more than that, Harrington replied. It's a story about choices. How Paulinus chose his battlefield, how Boudica chose rebellion, how the Roman administration chose exploitation over stability, and those choices echo through history. He picked up a modern, tactical analysis of the battle written by a British army officer. Military strategists still study Watling Street. The principle that discipline can overcome numerical disadvantage remains fundamental to modern warfare. The psychological impact of unified action against disorganized opponents is as relevant in Afghanistan or Iraq as it was in Roman Britain. On a misty morning in London, a young schoolgirl stood before the massive bronze statue of Boudica and her daughters in their war chariot on the Victoria Embankment. Her class had been studying the Roman period in Britain, and their teacher had brought them to see this famous monument. "Why does she look so angry?" the girl asked her teacher. "Because she was fighting for her people's freedom," the teacher explained. "The Romans had taken her land, hurt her family, and tried to take away her power as queen." "But she lost, didn't she?" "Yes, she did. The Romans had better training and tactics, even though her army was much larger." The girl studied the fierce expression on the statue's face, the way Boudica leaned forward in her chariot, arm raised in defiance. "I think I like her anyway," she decided. She tried to protect her people, even if she didn't win. The teacher smiled. "That's why we remember her after almost 2,000 years. Sometimes it matters that you fought, even if you didn't win." As the class moved on, the statue remained, its bronze patina catching the occasional rays of sunlight, breaking through London's clouds. Below it, the inscription read, "Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, who died AD 61 after leading her people against the Roman invader." The simple epitaph said nothing about her devastating defeat at Watling Street. In the long perspective of history, that single battle, however tactically brilliant, had become merely one chapter in a larger story about resistance, identity, and the complex legacy of conquest. Suetonius Paulinus saved Roman Britain through military genius and disciplined leadership. His victory at Watling Street deserves its place among history's most remarkable tactical achievements. Yet 2 millennia later, it is Boudica who has the statue on the embankment, Boudica whose name is taught to British schoolchildren, Boudica who symbolizes the enduring spirit of a nation. Perhaps that, ultimately, is the most profound lesson of Watling Street. Military victories, however decisive, are only part of a people's story. The rest belongs to memory, myth, and the peculiar alchemy of history that transforms even the defeated into enduring symbols of courage against overwhelming odds. Unearthing the secrets of Watling Street. The soil of Watling Street kept its secrets for centuries. While Roman historians Tacitus and Dio Cassius recorded the battle's outcome, the physical evidence remained elusive, a historical ghost haunting the English countryside, its exact location the subject of scholarly debate. Then, in the summer of 1989, a metal detectorist walking the fields near Manchester made an unexpected discovery. A cache of Roman military equipment deliberately buried in what appeared to be a ritual deposit. Dr. Eleanor Winters, then a junior archaeologist at the British Museum, arrived at the site within days. What began as a small exploratory dig soon expanded into a major archaeological project that would span 5 years and rewrite understanding of Britain's greatest rebellion. What we found challenged many of our assumptions, Winters explained 20 years later, standing at the edge of the now protected site. This wasn't just discarded equipment, it was a deliberate offering. Roman soldiers, hardened professionals though they were, had been sufficiently shaken by their experience that they felt compelled to propitiate their gods. The evidence painted a picture at odds with the triumphant narratives in Roman sources. Analysis of the buried items, primarily personal equipment rather than standard-issue gear, suggested they belonged to auxiliary troops, not legionaries. These soldiers, recruited from Rome's provinces rather than Italy itself, had faced the full fury of the British onslaught. The official accounts emphasize Roman discipline overcoming barbarian numbers, Winters noted. But the archaeological record tells us something more nuanced. The Roman forces were traumatized by what they'd experienced. The scale of the fighting, the closeness of their brush with annihilation, it left psychological scars that traditional Roman military stoicism couldn't accommodate. Scattered across the site, archaeologists discovered British artifacts as well, fragments of chariot fittings, ritual objects, and personal ornaments. Most revealing were the weapons, not the aristocratic swords depicted in Victorian paintings, but agricultural implements repurposed for war. Scythes, billhooks, even plowshares beaten into crude spearheads. This was the desperate arsenal of a people who had staked everything on one final confrontation. What's remarkable is the ingenuity, said Dr. James Farrell, specialist in Iron Age metalwork who analyzed the findings. These weren't primitive weapons. They were cleverly adapted tools. The British understood Roman armor weaknesses and designed implements specifically to exploit them. Roman armor was vulnerable at the joints. These hooked weapons could catch and pull away shields or drag down armored men. The most significant discovery came in 1992, a mass grave containing the remains of approximately 60 individuals. DNA analysis confirmed what anthropologists had suspected. These were not Roman soldiers, but British women, ranging in age from 16 to 60, all bearing evidence of violent death. This changed everything, Winters recalled. These women weren't just camp followers, they were combatants. Isotope analysis showed many weren't even Iceni, but came from tribes across Britain. This was truly a pan-British uprising, with women fighting alongside men. The remains told a grim story. Many showed defensive wounds on arms and hands, evidence of fighting to the last. More surprising was the presence of Roman weapons that had caused these injuries, not the gladius short sword used in formation fighting, but the pugio, the Roman military dagger designed for close-quarter killing. The implications are clear, said Winters. These women were killed during the collapsed retreat, when Roman discipline gave way to the frenzy of pursuit and slaughter that Tacitus alludes to, but doesn't detail. This wasn't combat, but execution. In a climate-controlled room at the British Museum's research facility, curator Dr. Martin Chen carefully opened a case containing the most controversial find from the Mansetter excavation, a small bronze seal ring bearing a woman's profile. "We can't prove it belonged to Boudica," he acknowledged, but the craftsmanship and materials suggest someone of high status. The profile matches general descriptions. The long hair especially is consistent with Dio's account. The ring had been found separate from the mass grave, buried deliberately in a small clay pot alongside personal items that included amber beads and a silver mirror. Ritual deposits of this nature were common in British funerary practices of the period, particularly for high-status individuals. If, and it's a significant if, this is connected to Boudica, it suggests she didn't die on the battlefield, Chen explained. Someone took these items, traveled some distance, and conducted proper burial rites. It contradicts both Tacitus's claim of suicide and Dio's account of illness. The controversy surrounding the ring exemplified the challenges facing modern scholars of Boudica. With limited written sources, all from the Roman perspective, archaeology provided crucial but ambiguous evidence. The ring might be Boudica's, or it might belong to another high-status British woman of the period. The mass grave might represent her final followers, or simply one group among many who died that day. What fascinates me isn't just what we know, but what remains hidden, Chen said. For all our technology and expertise, much of the Battle of Watling Street remains as mysterious as it was to Victorian historians. We still don't know exactly where Boudica died, or how. We still debate precisely where the main battle line formed. At RAF College Cranwell, Air Commodore Helena Pierce lectured officer cadets on the strategic lessons of Watling Street. A large tactical map of the probable battlefield dominated the screen behind her. Paulinus's genius wasn't just in choosing defensible terrain, she explained, but in understanding the psychological dimension of warfare. He recognized that Boudica's forces, despite their numbers, had critical vulnerabilities: poor unit cohesion, limited tactical coordination, and most importantly, overconfidence. The cadets, future leaders of Britain's Air Force, took notes as Pierce outlined parallels with modern asymmetric warfare. "What's the modern equivalent of Roman formation discipline?" she asked the room. "Technological superiority, ma'am," offered one cadet. "Integrated command and control," suggested another. Pierce nodded. "Both correct. But the deeper principle is force multiplication through systemic advantage. The Romans didn't just have better equipment or training. They had an entire system designed to maximize the effectiveness of each individual soldier. She clicked to a new slide showing a reconstruction of the Roman formation. "Look at this structure. Every soldier protected not just himself but his comrades. Every action reinforced the unit, rather than serving individual glory. This wasn't just tactically sound, it created a psychological fortress. Roman soldiers believed in the system, trusted it to protect them even when outnumbered. That certainty, that unshakable confidence was perhaps their greatest weapon." The lesson wasn't lost on the cadets. In an age of drone warfare and cyber operations, the human element, the psychology of combat, remained fundamental. Paulinus had understood this nearly 2 millennia earlier. "Remember this when you command," Pierce concluded. "Technology and tactics matter, but so does trust. Your personnel must believe absolutely in the systems you've established. That belief can overcome seemingly impossible odds, just as it did at Watling Street." In her London studio, artist Leila Mbeki put the finishing touches on a massive canvas commissioned for the British Library's new exhibition, Voices of Resistance, Colonial Encounters in the Ancient World. Her painting, Boudica's Last Stand, deliberately subverted traditional Victorian depictions of the Iceni queen. The Victorians gave us this romantic image, flowing red hair, noble features, essentially a British Britannia, Mbeki explained, wiping paint from her hands. They appropriated her as a symbol of British imperial power, which is deeply ironic given that she was fighting against an empire. Mbeki's Boudica was no romanticized heroine, but a hardened war leader, scarred, exhausted, grimly determined. The painting showed not the beginning of the charge, as in most depictions, but its aftermath. The moment when the British line began to collapse against the implacable Roman formation. I wanted to capture that pivotal moment when the outcome became inevitable, the artist said. Not because Boudica failed as a leader, but because she faced an opponent who had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest. The tragedy isn't that she lost, but that her cause, defending her people's autonomy, was probably doomed from the start. The painting deliberately echoed compositional elements from famous depictions of colonial conflicts worldwide: the Zulu War, the Indian Rebellion, the Native American resistance, creating visual connections across history. Boudica's story resonates because it's universal, Mbeki continued. Indigenous resistance against a technologically superior colonial power is a pattern repeated throughout history. We celebrate her courage while knowing the ending, which makes it all the more poignant. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 archaeologists walked the Leicestershire countryside, ground-penetrating radar equipment tracking behind them on a small cart. Dr. Winters, now director of the Boudican Research Project, pointed toward a gentle slope leading to a wooded valley. "That's where I believe the Roman line formed," she said to her younger colleague. "The geography matches Tacitus's description, and our surveys have found anomalies consistent with mass burials." The younger archaeologist, Dr. Anand, studied the landscape skeptically. "It lacks the dramatic funneling effect that most reconstructions emphasize. Because those reconstructions rely too heavily on Dio, who wrote a century after the events and never visited Britain," Winters replied. Tacitus had access to eyewitness accounts and described a more subtle tactical position: high ground with woods protecting the Roman rear, not the narrow defile popular in Victorian illustrations. Their equipment beeped, indicating an anomaly. Both archaeologists knelt to examine the reading. "Metal concentration," Anand noted. "Large area, approximately 60 centimeters down." Winters nodded, excitement visible despite her professional restraint. "Consistent with our other findings. Mark it for the excavation team." As they continued their survey, Winters reflected on the decades she'd dedicated to understanding this single day in British history. "What fascinates me is that we're still finding new evidence. This battlefield has been here all along, waiting for us to ask the right questions." "And what are the right questions?" Anand asked. "Not just who won and lost, or how many died," Winters replied. "But what this confrontation reveals about both societies, Roman and British,